Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about the answers for reading quiz chapter 11. In this chapter we learn about the model aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and this is a simple model and that explains how the change in spending or the production affects the equilibrium level of GDP and also the price level. So let's start with the first question. Based on Say's law, Say's law actually one of the classical economists, and according to Say's law it says that supply creates its own demand. So everything starts with supply and the focus is on the aggregate supply, and aggregate supply creates its own demand. That's the idea. And Say's law is relevant for the long run in the economy. So we need to look at the answers that includes long run. In the long run, the demand for a $10 product generates the supply of a $10 product. That's not correct. If you remember, supply creates its own demand. In the long run, the production and sales of a $10 product generates $10 of income for someone and $10 of demand. That's the correct answer. And the remaining are related to short run, therefore they are not correct. Question number 2. Which of the following scenarios would result in a decrease in aggregate demand? So let's understand aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is a downward sloping curve where we have the price level, which here you can think about this is GDP deflator, price index, or CPI. This is the price index that represents the overall prices in the economy. And here we have the real GDP. And aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So that means when the prices are cheaper, aggregate demand, spending, total expenditure in the economy increases. So let's understand this curve. This curve represents the total spending for now. And total spending is composed of consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Net exports represents exports minus imports. So any changes in consumption, people spend more, aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. Remember, right is an increase and left is a decrease. And investment spending could be an expansion of a factory, capital, purchase of new capital, machinery. Any increase on that will increase aggregate demand curve. If government spends more or cut taxes, also aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. Here, if exports increases, that means people, foreigners, are buying more of our products. Therefore, aggregate demand curve is going to increase. For imports, you have to be careful. Although it's negative here, an increase in imports will be also included somewhere in one of the components of C, I, and G. Therefore, imports doesn't affect the aggregate spending. So if, for instance, you buy $50 of French wine, it's an import, you subtract from this total spending, but also it's a consumption. Therefore, they cancel each other and imports do not affect. So we need to find a factor that affects either consumption, investment, government spending on exports to find the right answer. So the first one, a decline in investors' confidence causes investment to fall. That is going to definitely shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So because of a decrease in investment at all prices, aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the left. So that is the correct answer. The second one is a rise in imports from Europe. Remember, imports, although it has a negative sign here, the accounting, international accounting tells that if you change the import here, one of the components here also changes. Therefore, they cancel each other and imports doesn't change the total spending. And next one, technology improvements lead to productivity gains. Productivity gains is going to change the aggregate supply curve. And I will talk about aggregate supply curve later on. And the last one, the Congress passes a new income tax cut. This is going to actually affect the consumption because tax cut is going to increase consumption. An increase in consumption increases aggregate demand instead of decreasing aggregate demand. Therefore, the right answer is the first option. Question number 3, according to the Keynes law. So Keynes is the opposite of Say, and Keynes said that demand creates its own supply. And that theory is relevant in the short run. So also we need to talk about Keynesian aggregate supply curve. So here is again, aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. We have the price index here, price index, and we have the real GDP here. And the supply curve is like this. So supply curve is actually in this zone is flat. And that reflects the Keynesian part. Okay, Keynesian theory says that when you increase the aggregate demand, which we can draw it here with a different color, if you are in this zone, Keynesian zone, if you increase the aggregate demand, let's say from here to here aggregate demand increases, that means spending is increasing, demand is increasing. You do not see an increase in the price level that much, but output level increases. That means production increases. More production means less unemployment. That's what Keynes says. And this represents intermediate zone. In this intermediate zone, when you increase the aggregate demand, you are actually increasing both prices and both output increases. And this part represents, here it's actually more steeper, this part represents the neoclassical. And in this section, if you increase the aggregate demand curve, let's increase the aggregate demand curve, you are not actually increasing output anymore, but you are increasing the prices a lot. So higher spending creates an inflationary pressure in the economy. So let's draw the three zones again. We have the price level here. This is the price index. This is the real GDP and the Keynes, and like that. This is aggregate supply curve, and that represents long run aggregate supply curve, and it is on potential output. This is potential or full employment level of output. Let's say Yn, and let's say this Y. And then here, as we said, represents Keynesian zone. And here to here represents intermediate zone. And here to here represents neoclassical or Say's law. And then also we reach to the potential boundary, and that represents the long run production in the economy. So in the long run, we reach the boundaries, full employment level, we reach the resource capacity of the economy. Therefore, aggregate supply curve doesn't change with the prices, and it becomes vertical. So Keynesian argue that unfortunately we are not in this zone. Okay, we are usually in Keynesian zone. Therefore, we are usually below the potential output level. So we are not in the full employment level. Full employment level refers to utilizing of all resources. So based on this, we need to find the right answer. The first one says the total demand for products determine the level of gross domestic product and may not equal to supply capacity of the economy in the short run. This looks like correct to me because it says that we are not always full capacity of the economy, and most of the time the total demand for products are usually different than the supply of the economy. The second option, the total demand tends to rise above the total supply capacity in the short run, which leads to recession. That's not correct. He usually says the reverse. Demand is less than supply capacity. That leads to recessions. Total supply of products determines the level of gross domestic product. This is not correct because this is what neoclassical says. Total demand always equals to total supply capacity in the short run. This is also not correct. So the first one is correct. Question number 4. Which of the following statements best describes the aggregate supply curve? So let's draw the aggregate supply curve. Remember, aggregate supply curve shows the relation between price level, which is a price index, and real GDP. And it is a curve like this. Aggregate supply curve. So let's find out which answer is correct. The aggregate supply curve represents the relation between the inflation rate. That's not correct. Not the inflation rate. This is the price index like GDP deflator or consumer price index. The aggregate supply curve represents the relationship between the price level and the potential output or GDP in the economy. Remember, this is real GDP. It's not the potential output. Potential output is the level that the economy can reach in the long run. Let's say this is QN, the potential output. The aggregate supply curve represents the relationship between the inflation rate, again it's not the inflation rate, And the last option, the aggregate supply curve, represents the relation between the price level and the total output or real GDP in the macroeconomy. That's correct. Question number 5, if the price level increases in the economy, so if the price level increases in the economy, we know that none of the curves are going to shift. Why? Because price level is on the vertical axis here. Let's draw the aggregate demand curve. Let's say aggregate demand curve is here. And none of the curves are going to shift. If you remember from demand and supply chapter, if the price level changes, you move along the curve, either aggregate demand curve or aggregate supply curve. But we know that if the price levels are decreasing, total spending in the economy will fall. Why? Because if you just increase the price level from here P1 to P2, look what happens. You are moving along the curve. Your total spending is here. And because you move to P2, total spending decreases to here. Therefore, the right answer is the last one. Question 6, the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So why do we use aggregate demand and aggregate supply? First of all, the intersection of AS and AD tells us about the equilibrium level of GDP in the economy. Therefore, it identifies the equilibrium GDP. And the price level, as you see here, we have the equilibrium price level and equilibrium real GDP, as well as the gap between the equilibrium GDP and potential GDP. So this is potential GDP. Remember, potential GDP is the maximum amount of GDP we can get in the long run while using all our resources. And if the equilibrium GDP is here, let's say this is equilibrium, then it can tell us about the gap between equilibrium GDP and the potential GDP. Therefore, this is the right answer. Question 7. Based on the data in the table and graph below, identify the equilibrium GDP. Equilibrium GDP is where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. That means total spending should equal to total production. And that's only possible if two curves intersect. And here, $140 billion is the equilibrium GDP. And equilibrium price is 100. Question 8, the long run aggregate supply curve. Remember the long run aggregate supply curve. Let's draw it again. This is our price level, price indices. And here we have the real GDP. And the aggregate supply curve is flat in the short run, then starts sloping. And it becomes vertical at the potential GDP. Let's say it's Q1. So let's look at the answers. Upward sloping at the potential GDP. It's not correct. It's vertical at the potential GDP. And you can see here it's vertical. Vertical at the potential GDP is correct. Downward sloping is not correct because it's upward sloping. Above the short run aggregate supply curve. It's the continuation of the short run supply curve. It becomes vertical in the long run. So therefore, the right answer is the second option. Number 9, which of the following would cause the aggregate supply curve to increase? So let's talk about the determinants of aggregate supply. So again, I'm going to draw the aggregate supply curve here. We have price indices and then we have the real GDP here. Aggregate supply is flat and then slopes upward and becomes vertical at the potential GDP. In the long run. This is aggregate supply curve. So first of all, aggregate supply curve in the short run, which represents this intermediate zone and below that vertical part, can increase with the increase of the prices. Okay, when the prices rise, but this prices doesn't include the input cost. That means these are the prices of final goods they sell. When the prices rise, their profit rises. Therefore, in the short run, aggregate supply increases with the price level. That's why it's upward sloping in the short run. In the long run, it's vertical. Why? Because that vertical part represents that prices no longer make a change in the long run. Why? Because when the prices of final products increase, people will realize that their wage is not enough to buy this same goods and services before, so they will demand higher wages. When wages started to increase, therefore, we see a shrink in the profitability, and in the long run, we also reach to the capacity of the economy. All the resources are used. Therefore, aggregate supply curve, which is actually long run aggregate supply curve, doesn't change with the price level. but short-run aggregate supply does. So price affects short-run aggregate supply curve, but price doesn't affect long-run aggregate supply curve. What else? Short-run aggregate supply curve can shift because of increase in input prices, like energy prices, increase in energy prices, increase in wages, increase in cost of production. And short-run aggregate supply curve can increase because of increase in productivity. So the labor productivity might shift because of a technology or other reasons. Therefore, short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. And in addition to that, long-run aggregate supply curve also increases with increase in productivity. Long-run aggregate supply curve can also increase in physical capital, human capital, right? Remember these factors that we talk about, and technology. Long-run aggregate supply curve can have a negative impact if most of the workers go to the war, right? There is a war. So there is going to be a decrease in long-run aggregate supply curve. And as you realize, long-run aggregate supply curve is mostly related to real factors rather than price. So let's find out the answer. Which of the following would cause the aggregate supply curve to increase? Energy prices such as gas and electricity have increased rapidly throughout the country. So this will decrease the aggregate supply curve. Why? Because it's becoming more costly to produce goods and services. Second option, throughout the economy, workers are using better equipment and output per hour is rising. This will definitely increase aggregate supply curve. Consumers are more confident and spending more than before. This is not going to shift the aggregate supply curve, but that is going to shift aggregate demand curve. Remember, aggregate demand curve refers to total spending. The last option, the government has reduced its spending by more than 10%. Again, this is going to change the total spending because government spending included in the aggregate demand curve. Question number 10. Which of the following would cause the aggregate supply curve to move from AS, which is the blue, dark blue one, to AS2. That means there is a decrease in aggregate supply. So we need to find a reason that shifts the aggregate supply curve to the left. A general decrease in labor costs for businesses, it's going to increase aggregate supply curve because production becomes more profitable. Therefore, it's going to shift to the right, not to the left. A federal government increase in spending. This is related to aggregate demand curve. Remember, total spending also includes the government spending. A general increase in energy and labor costs. This is going to shift the aggregate supply curve from here, the dark blue one, to the light blue one. An increase in productivity actually going to increase the aggregate supply curve. Thank you for watching this video.